If you've experienced trauma and you also think you might be autistic, it might be really challenging to pinpoint where things stem from. It's such a tangled web. And so I just read this article by Michelle Garnett and Tony Atwood. I know some people love them, some people don't, but I thought the article was very informative and it kind of untangles that web. So I'm going to share with you what I learned from the article and also include a few of my personal notes. They talk about the onset, observable patterns of behavior, common communication issues, sensory sensitivities, and emotional responses in both trauma and autism so that we can distinguish from where they're rooted. So let's start first with the onset of behaviors. Signs of trauma happen after a triggering event such as abuse, neglect, loss, a significant life change, and you've probably heard of CPTSD, which is complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And that occurs when a triggering event is prolonged, repeated, or virtually impossible to get away from. Now, it's interesting to note that for autistic people, triggering events can also include adverse childhood events, sexual abuse, sadly, is very common, and also violence. But also, autistic people can be triggered or have trauma over things that the DSM-5 does not consider traumatic, such as bullying, social exclusion, and also sensory trauma. Now, the onset or presentation of autism is quite different. It presents at birth. Although the signs may not be real obvious until later in childhood, if the signs are external, i.e. not masked, or even adolescence or adulthood, if they are internal, meaning camouflaged. So it's important to note that there are no triggering events for autism, and trauma does not cause autism. Now let's talk about observable patterns of behavior, and we'll start with trauma. So in trauma, there is avoidance, there is hypervigilance, there's visible distress and anxiety, nightmares, and also strong reactions to the things that trigger them. But the behaviors come and go. Sometimes people are fine, sometimes they're not. It just depends on whether or not they are triggered. Now, CPSD can add another layer on top of these things, which is a negative self-image, emotional dysregulation, and difficulty keeping relationships. Now, this is different from autism because the observable patterns of behavior include hand flapping or rocking, an insistence on sameness and routines. They do have, we do have social communication challenges, but they're not usually rooted in a specific event. Two very interesting things to note is that autistic people can come up with methods and strategies to suppress these behaviors, to mask them, but also autistic people are aware of these strategies that they have and also can remember when and where they started. Now let's talk about communication issues. If trauma is the root, a person might withdraw out of fear, anxiety, distrust, and there is a noticeable shift in their social communication after a triggering event. Now, this is very different from autism, where social communication is intrinsic and it's long-standing, meaning autistic people don't understand neurotypical conversations, including nonverbal communication, tone of voice. They don't understand unspoken social rules, how to make and keep friendships. And these are very consistent and they're due to a difference in wiring. Next, let's talk about sensory sensitivities. In trauma, sensitivities can develop after a traumatic event, especially if the event involved sensory experiences. But with autism, This is pretty much consistent through life. As a matter of fact, sensory sensitivities are a core feature of autism. People can be either oversensitive, hyper, or under hyposensitive, or both. One thing I recently learned is that there's something considered another sense, and that is vestibular, which is balance. And after my trip and fall in Scotland, I definitely have real world experience with vestibular. Now, I want to make a note, and I might cut this out, but this is one of the ways that I realized I actually had autism. Because even though trauma explained away a lot of my behaviors, there was nothing that could explain all my sensory sensitivities, and there are a ton. Now let's talk about emotional responses. In trauma, these are tied to specific triggers, and they usually include intense fear, anxiety, sadness, anger. But usually they're in response to certain situations or triggers. In people with autism, intense emotional experiences are quite common, especially stress, anxiety, overwhelm, and depression. So common, in fact, that they are considered intrinsic to autism. Now, a few interesting sub-features of those responses is that they can be atypical or kind of disconnected to the situation. In other words, an autistic person might laugh when crying is more appropriate. Sometimes they are disproportionate to the situation. Sometimes there is no perceivable trigger. And many times autistic people have trouble expressing their emotions, especially if they have intellectual disabilities or alexithymia. I hope this has been helpful. I know it was helpful to me. So I will link that article in the description, and I'm looking forward to your comments. I hope you all have a wonderful day.